Not exactly aiming high in this Air Force. This is Sega Masters. Looking at this old-fashioned title screen, you'd think we were covering a game from the early days of the Famicom instead of a 1989 release on the Master System. In any case, today's episode focuses on Bomber Raid, a vertical shoot-'em-up for the console that was developed by Senritsu for Sega, who published it in Japan and Europe, while it was the third of the 3 Master System games distributed in North America by Activision during the first month of 1989. It's easy to say Activision's run on Sega's console has been somewhat underwhelming, yet it's not their fault the titles Sega supplied for them to publish in the States weren't exactly shining examples of quality. Cyborg Hunter was a promising title that did very little with the ingredients it had at its disposal, and that was followed by a home conversion of Midway's arcade hit Rampage, which looked okay but was just another home port of Rampage. Now we have Bomber Raid, whose half-hearted first impression doesn't offer much hope for a satisfying conclusion to this trilogy, though this lack of effort by Sega might be explained by how this cart actually marked the end of an era for the Master System. From the moment it first debuted as the Mark III in the fall of 1985, Sega's 8-bit console was never able to gain any real traction in its native Japan due to Nintendo all but owning the video game industry. And by the end of 1988, the company decided it was time to cut their losses with the Master System and cast their lots with their new 16-bit platform, the Mega Drive, which launched in October of that year to serve as their new best hope against the Nintendo juggernaut. With the Mega Drive all but becoming Sega's sole focus in Japan, Bomber Raid served as the Master System's swan song in the land of the rising sun after just over 3 years on the Japanese market, though the console's demise across the Pacific Ocean didn't affect its run in North America and Europe, at least not at the moment. Now, as we've seen throughout this series, vertical shooters on the Master System haven't fared very well, yet just a few episodes ago that string of mediocrity was finally broken by Power Strike from Compile, who is beginning to establish themselves as a masterful crafter of exciting blastathons with plenty of frenetic action and cool special weapons that allowed you to unleash mass destruction. Unfortunately, Bomber Raid ends up being a step backward compared to Power Strike, as the Master System didn't exactly get a special send-off in Japan. This cart casts you as a fighter pilot involved in a war of some sort against an unspecified enemy force. You're given your orders at the beginning of each stage before you take to the skies to launch your offensive assault against this supposedly hostile empire. Right from the opening moments, Bomber Raid plays like Sega just wanted to quickly throw this last cartridge together and push it out before leaving the 8-bit console behind in the Eastern market, as it offers only 5 levels of no-frills shooting action with the setting and gameplay all but cribbed from Capcom's early arcade hit 1942, with no innovation present. Plus, you'll notice that you're clearly flying a World War II style propeller plane, despite both of the game's Western releases depicting a stealth bomber on the box cover for no real reason. Each lengthy vertically scrolling stage consists of you maneuvering your plane through the air while gunning down the approaching waves of the usual military hardware of aircraft, tanks, submarines, battleships, and so forth, as well as a mid-level sub-boss that tries to impede your progress. Like always, your plane starts out rather slow and with a pretty weak gun as its primary weapon, though you're also supplied with a limited amount of cluster bombs that are handy for taking out large enemies or multiple attackers. And as is also the case in most other shooters, you can power up your gun and increase your speed by collecting the P and S icons from the UFO-like sprites that cross your path. Then there are the numbered icons, which produce a small drone to act as your wingman, providing extra offense and even acting as a shield of sorts. Shooting these chips before snagging them will cycle through 4 digits, each of which determines where the drone attaches itself and which direction it shoots. On the other hand, don't look for any special weapons to arm yourself with. Aside from the cluster bombs, your main gun is your sole means of offense, though it does become considerably more formidable as you collect the P chips. Its simple gameplay certainly pales in comparison to Power Strike, or even the shooters appearing on the NES around this same time, most notably Capcom's home adaptation of 1943, the arcade sequel to 1942. Most of that coin-up's features carried over to the cartridge, such as the life meter and selectable power-ups, But Capcom went one step further by including an RPG-ish attribute system where you can earn and assign points to permanently bolster your stats. Certainly more than any other shooter at the time offered. Bomber Raid, on the other hand, doesn't bring anything new or unique to the shooter table, as it was obvious the programmers were simply going through the motions here and had no interest in doing anything outside of the bare minimum. Eventually you confront your quarry at the end of the level, and the bosses are nothing special, simply enlarged versions of the standard enemies. Obviously you need to take them out by attacking their weak spots while avoiding the projectiles being sent back at you, but if you're sufficiently powered up and have a few cluster bombs saved up, you should have little trouble dispatching these behemoths. Following your successful boss battle, you're awarded bonus points based on how many of the level's enemies you eliminated. Then you're presented with your next objective, and it's on to the following stage with a fresh stock of cluster bombs to boot. Gameplay-wise, Bomber Raid doesn't really do anything wrong. It's easy enough to pick up and dive into, and the controls are responsive enough. It just doesn't offer anything outside of the straight up meat and potatoes action, which we've seen numerous times before. All you do is blast groups of enemies, collect a few power-ups, defeat a giant boss, repeat. And there's nothing new or innovative to add any much needed flavor to the vanilla gameplay. Some sources have suggested that Bomber Raid is in fact a redesigned home version of a 1987 coin-op Sega only released in Europe and Japan known as Sonic Boom. Despite the cool sounding title and some nice visuals, it was a rather plodding and generic mid-80s shooter that, much like Bomber Raid, offered next to nothing to distinguish itself from other similar games of its type and is all but forgotten today, outside of a few European computer ports. While Bomber Raid does share a few features with Sonic Boom, such as the drones and the intro to each level, it's pretty much an entirely different game for the most part. The nondescript action is also plagued by a somewhat polarizing difficulty curve that jumps between two extremes. It starts out slowly without much activity from your aggressors, and while it takes quite a few P-icons to boost your main gun into something worthwhile, the power-up UFOs appear frequently enough in the opening moments that you can bulk yourself up into an unstoppable killing machine in almost no time at all, allowing you to plow through the levels and bosses with ease. At the same time, your plane dies from one hit, and while you immediately respawn right where you perished at, your next life begins back in your default state with a weak pea shooter and sluggish speed. Just one mistake during the latter levels when the intensity finally gets cranked up means you're pretty much dead meat, and forget about standing a chance against the bosses without a decent gun. Granted, power-up UFOs are still plentiful, yet you'll be too busy dodging the numerous baddies and projectiles coming your way to be able to collect any of the icons. It also doesn't help that both your and your foes' bullets can easily blend into the brown dirt backgrounds when you're flying over a landmass, meaning you can suffer some surprise deaths without knowing what happened. At least the ocean offers a blue background that allows you to see what's coming much easier. Speaking of which, the vibrantly colored visuals don't do much to impress either, with little variety in the terrain except in certain locations. The sprites are decent enough, and to their credit the large bosses are well detailed. The way your plane leans as you move in either side direction is a nice touch as well. The soundtrack only consists of a few unmemorable background tunes, the most prevalent being a boppy ditty that plays during the main gameplay which tries to sound heroic but quickly grows tiresome. There isn't much more to say about Bomber Raid. It's playable, but offers nothing to keep you interested as Sega just couldn't be bothered to devote too much time and effort into the Master System's final cartridge in Japan. It won't take too long to see everything this card has to offer, especially with unlimited continues and a stage select cheat available, and upon defeating the supposed final boss at the end of the 5th level, you're given a brief congratulatory sequence before the game loops the levels over at a higher difficulty. With so many other shoot-em-ups providing much more substance and bang for your buck, there's no real reason to fire this card up unless you have the desire to play every shooter out there, and you may get a slight bit of enjoyment out of it before moving on to something else. While Bomber Raid closed the Master System story in Japan, we're not quite done with Mark III games just yet, as 4 cards Sega previously released for their 8-bit console in 1987 and 88 would finally get Western localizations over the following months, and we'll cover each of them in due time. But from here on out, the Master System would basically be a Western market only console, with some good years still ahead of it, though by the end of 1989 it would seemingly drop off the radar in another territory as well.